Hello, Nicole Tallman. So good to meet you in Zoom person. I don't think I've ever met you in person before. Um, for the South Florida Poetry Review and for the Miami Book Fair. For our viewers, I'm Elisa Albo. I'm an associate editor like you for the South Florida Poetry Journal, a poet and a professor of English at Broward College. It's a special privilege to speak with you today about Something Kindred, your beautiful, poignant debut book. Before we jump in, I'm going to read your bio for our audience. Nicole Tallman is a poet, ghostwriter, and editor. Born and raised in Michigan, she lives in Miami, serves as the poetry ambassador for Miami-Dade County Mayor Daniela Levine Cava, poetry and interviews editor for the Blue Mountain Review, and an associate editor, as I mentioned, for South Florida Poetry Journal. She is the author of Something Kindred, from the Southern Collective Experience Press, and her next two books, Poems for the People and Versace, are forthcoming from Really Serious Literature and Redacted Books, respectively. She's also the editor of Stay Golden, a Golden Girls-inspired special zine published by the Daily Drunk, and co-editor with Maureen Seaton of We Who Rise from Salt Water, Let's Sing, a collaborative heroic sonnet crown for the mayor and residents of Miami-Dade County. So welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for taking the time to interview me today. And thank you always to Book Fair and to South Florida Poetry Journal, which are both near and dear to my heart.
Yes. So Something Kindred, for me, is a moving, intimate, and in a way instructive book for all of us who have been touched or inevitably will be touched by loss of a loved one, a parent, a mother. As you say in your note to the reader at the start, grieving is a messy, personal process with no timeline. And your hope is that it will inspire the reader to write through their grief. Your book is that kind of inspiration and more. What we so often seek at those most difficult moments of grief, it's understanding articulated, hope, courage personified. I was wondering if you could speak to when and how your process or practice began to take shape as a collection.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for saying those kind things about my book. I really, truly appreciate that. In terms of process, this book actually started out as a pandemic book. I worked for the previous mayor of Miami-Dade County as well, and I was working really long hours. And in between the moments, I needed to decompress a little bit. And so I started writing some poems to kind of process the grief that came out of working from home and everything being shut down. It was a very traumatizing time for a lot of us. And as I started writing those poems, I also started to realize that my mother kind of kept coming up in other ways as well. And so I played with writing some of those poems out as well, but it was very difficult for me. I struggled a lot writing about her. It took me a long time to actually accept the fact that she was gone. And so I was approached by this gentleman named Clifford Brooks from the Southern Collective Experience Press. He had come across some of my work and he asked me if I had a manuscript. And I said, I do. And so I sent it to him, and it was mostly pandemic poems. And he looked at it and he said, well, this is really great, but I'm not sure people want to hear this much about the pandemic. Would you be willing to rework this at all? And I said, I think I have an idea. And so I reworked the book and I took out all of the pandemic poems.
Wow.
Yes. And I just wrote everything out. I just got it out of my system about my grief about my mother's death, which for those of you who haven't read the book, she passed away from ovarian cancer in January of 2017. And so it took me about 5 years to actually write about that. And I did it in small chunks. And I wrote out the most difficult parts. And when I got towards the end of it, I said to myself, this is a really dark book. And I don't mind that, but I want people to be able to see light at the end of the tunnel. And that's why, if you notice kind of the progression of the book towards the end, it ends on what I would consider a fairly positive poem, which is sort of this daughter's reconciling her grief with remembering everything that she loves and what's left to live for. And so that poem was the very last poem that I wrote. And I wrote it one line, one day at a time.
Wow.
Yes, as inspired by one of my favorite poets, which Michael, who I know is listening, always makes fun of me because I'm always going on and on about Alex Dimitrov, but I love him and I love his work. And I came across a poem called Love on Twitter, and I wanted to do something similar. So that's what I did. And yeah, that's kind of how it took shape. It was also a messy process, Elisa, like, right? It
Yes.
wasn't like this book just came out all whole. It's something formed.
Wow.
And the book was originally called The New Normal.
Mm.
Yeah, it was called The New Normal because from the previous mayor, I had worked on the new normal guidelines for shutting down and reopening the county. That was one of my jobs as the legislative and policy director. Yeah, so I had written this book of poems called The New Normal, and then I completely reworked it at the publisher's request,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a very cathartic experience for me. And I'm glad he said what he said to me, because I'm not sure I would have written this book if he would have just accepted the pandemic book. I might have just said, okay, here you go, and I would have published that.
Right.
Yeah.
I have 2 unpublished pandemic manuscripts.
Oh my.
I wonder if, you're making me rethink a lot of things. But I know where your current title comes from. So how did that happen for you, that you changed the title
Well,
of Something Kindred?
I'm going to tell you a little secret, and I don't know
Okay.
that many poets would admit this. Well, it's not a secret anymore because I'm telling the world it's recorded, but I did not come up with that title. I have a very good friend. His name is Jared Beloff. He's also a poet. He lives in Queens. And I had sent him my draft manuscript, and I said, I'm having a hard time coming up with a title for this. I want you to read it, and I want you to tell me what you think it should be called. And he read it, and he said, Something Kindred.
Oh, wow.
And I said, oh my God, I love that. Sometimes you have to ask other people.
Yeah.
Like, we're too close to it, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. That's nothing to be ashamed of. I think as writers, we need that sometimes. Like you said, we're too close. We don't really see it. We definitely need that. Wow, I love that. I love that story. And I love that that as we read this collection, that there is, for me, I see prose, I see what you call your confessions, poetry, which they could be poetry, but they're called confessions. They're often singular lines. It's like a variety of genres or subgenres, new forms even, is what I see in this book. We so rarely get to experience or publish in a sense, a kind of multi-genre book. It's usually all prose, memoir, short stories, a novel, or all poetry. And there's something so, and I want to show the book also, there's something so satisfying, so readable and coherent, really, about experiencing writing that varies in structure, or I almost want to say like in vehicle, of what you're communicating. I'm also thinking, I don't know if you've ever heard of Judy Cofer. She was a Puerto Rican writer. She passed away about 6 years ago. But she wrote a book. I loved her work. She actually taught at some point at Broward College, but she was mostly at the University of Georgia. And she published several books and all different genres. She published poetry books, she published a novel, possibly a memoir, but she wrote a book called The Latin Deli, and she also has a poem by that name. And it was prose and poetry, and the title is Prose and Poetry. And I always marveled that she got that published. I didn't think you would be allowed to do that, or that publishers would do that. Was any of that ever a thought for you at all? Or, I mean, you were doing it to, it seems like you were doing it to get it published. So you knew it was going to get published, I suppose.
I
Yeah.
did. Um,
Yeah.
my publisher gave me a lot of freedom. I will say
Yeah.
that. And it was something I asked for. And I wanted to do a hybrid book because I am a writer by profession, a ghostwriter, a speechwriter, and I write in so many different forms, right? I write
Yeah.
speeches, correspondence, briefings, bullet points. And so I just wanted to get it out, and whatever shape it took, I wanted to honor that. I didn't want to rein it in and force it to be poetry. But I also
Right.
feel like the lines between poetry and prose have blurred. And I know there's a lot of debate about what a poem is, right? And I tend to write more prose poetry than I do any other form. It just comes naturally to
Yeah.
me because I'm used to this sort of like press release or speech or formal corporate government structure, right?
Yeah.
So sentences make more sense for me. And so I didn't want to call it poetry and then have people say, this isn't poetry, right? So I felt like I was also opening up the mind to have a little bit more flexibility, because I was almost afraid that if I just called it poems, people were going to say this isn't poetry.
Right. Right.
And I don't know who makes those decisions
Yeah.
either,
Who
right?
makes
You know?
those rules?
Exactly.
Right.
But I felt more comfortable saying this is prose and poetry,
Mm-hmm.
by having those blocks of thought with white space. And also the confessions to me felt more like prose and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
poetry. And so that's why I did that. And I was very grateful that my publisher allowed me to do that. And I asked, I said, can I do
That's
something?
wonderful.
Do you mind?
Mm-hmm.
He said, no, not at all. Whatever feels right to you. So I really do have to thank him for allowing me that, because I don't know that another publisher would. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to go with a small publisher,
Mm-hmm.
because I mean, look, I've never been approached by a large publisher, full disclosure, but if I had, I don't know that they allow it so much. I feel like they do really want you to write one or the other, right?
Well,
But
they
they
often silo, writers, even in genres, and absolutely, it's not really done that much, except possibly by some small presses, that might allow what you said, a hybrid, but we don't really come across, that very often. I mean, the Latin Deli goes back, I don't know, probably more than 30 years. I mean, it goes back way back. So I remember at the time marveling that she was able to do that back then. But even today, you don't really see it. You don't see it that much. I love when I know I was published once in a food anthology that also included recipes, and I loved that. The idea that you could also have recipes in there, just changing it up like that. Um, well, to illustrate the lovely variety of the work that you have, I'd like to ask you first to read a poem. And I know you've read it before and very recently at your wonderful swim reading at the Betsy, but I'd like you to introduce and read on reading poems. I now sympathize with daughters of dead mothers, from your book.
Okay, I could do that for you.
Okay.
Kind of sort of the titular poem without being it, right?
Yeah, yeah, it is.
I don't have a poem called Something Kindred, but this is the one that does reference something kindred. So
Exactly.
on reading poems, I now sympathize with daughters of dead mothers, for Frida Hughes. It's hard to look at this picture of Frida and not feel something tragic. Mother, father, brother dead, one by oven, one by cancer, one by hanging. It's hard just to look at this picture of Frida with her menagerie of pets, poems, and paintings. Yes, I mean the Frida with an E, not Frida Kahlo. Frida Hughes, I want to buy one of your paintings, a green one, representing the joy of being able to work on my poetry or something other creative. Frida Hughes, I want to eat all of your mother's poems and all of your paintings. It's hard not to look at Frida and feel something kindred, us daughters of dead mothers. It's hard to look at Frida and feel something so protective, to say to us through our mothers, there, you made it.
It was so moving. So something kindred. I mean, you can see, now you see it, and it's wonderful that your friend and reader was able to see that right there, for the title. This poem and also the final poem that you mentioned on love uses or the repetition of a phrase. And this one, it's hard to look, it's hard not to look, and other variations. And on love, the final poem, which I'm going to ask you to read in a moment, it's I love, and as I said, I'm gonna go back to that. But first, I want to tell you that I read your interview, which is wonderful, on Ara Martin's website. She asked what drew you to poetry, and I liked your answer that that you like poetry for its sound, compression, and freedom. That's so true for myself as well, for the reasons that you give, but also it so well reflects this book, I thought, and we've already been touching on this, but it reflects, with sound. I hear your voice in this book, the compression of the individual pieces as well. And I especially love what you say about the idea of freedom, that you like all forms, and that there's so much variety in poetry, and that one can make and break rules, which is like what we were talking about, what you were saying, that, who makes these rules anyway? And I love that. And you do that so much with this book. And I thought maybe we could illustrate that just a little bit, by having you read the confession on page 37. And then if you could please follow that with the concrete poem on 39. And I'll show that poem as you read it as well.
Sure. So it's so interesting to hear people's reaction to your work. And I do have a love of anaphora. I find myself writing a lot of poems with repetition. So I love that you picked up on that, because I didn't really notice that I had done that with On Reading, but I did notice I did it on Love. So
okay.
Wow.
And I'm going to say something else about all of that in a little bit. Okay, go ahead.
So you want me to read the confession? Okay, confession.
Yeah, I'm 37.
Confession. I never imagined the loneliness of grieving a loss without you. And then the concrete poem is on grieving. So you'd like me to read this?
Yes.
Okay. Wow, it's really fun to read it in this form.
Yes.
This is the first time I think I've done it this way. I'm going to try, because usually I sort of reformat it so I can read it better, but I'm
okay. That's okay.
Here we go.
Okay.
On grieving. Mute, scream, travel, retreat, starve, binge, drink, abstain, shop, save, Netflix, Hulu, write, read, hot-powered, yoga, kundalini, do something drastic to your appearance, wear the same outfit for days on end, work, sleep, breathe, repeat. Grief is a blurry, imperfect circle.
And I'll just show that once more. I just think that's so amazing, the way it captures in content and form, the grieving process. It's called On Grieving. It's just it's brilliant, really. And it just moved me very much to read that, and I wanted to share that with our audience. So, what I wanted to bring back is that and we've been talking about the shape of your book, that books will often have an epigraph at the start. They might have a preface, sometimes a foreword, an intro, an afterword, other extra matter around the story, essays or poems. And I find that every part of your book, and you have a lot of different parts, and even though it's a small book, you have a lot of different parts. But every part of your book is the book. It is the whole. And I was especially taken by your note to reader at the start, you know, the guidance, the generosity, the permission in a way that you give the reader, the often grieving reader, to grieve and work through it. And then the last poem on love, which we have mentioned, is a list or an Afro poem that repeats. And what I wanted to say about that, and also, you know, the poem you read, is that that kind of, it's almost like an exercise that invites the reader to do what you've done, to grieve. And it also shows that no matter how hard, difficult, or devastating death is, after there is love, life, gratitude, purpose, meaning. Um, and it works like something that the reader could use as well. I mean, so often when we do poetry workshops, we begin with a line or a phrase or something to prompt, you know, the writers. And, you know, given what you say that you want your readers to get from this, you're giving them that that prompt. You're giving them that help with these poems, and I think that's just really, really wonderful. So I'm going to ask you to read on love.
Oh, such a pleasure. I love reading this
Oh,
poem.
good.
Added another line. Did you notice that? Uh, on love after Alex Dimitrov. I love morning before I've used my voice. I love morning before anyone has spoken. I love Miami in February. I love the word petrichor. I love the smell of petrichor. I love velvet blazers and wearing them despite the weather and occasion. I love buying myself red roses. I love drinking rose water. I love chartreuse, champagne, and chambord. I love the way that sounds. I love finding books with old notes hidden between the pages. I love that my cat looks annoyed when I come home from work. I love that my partner looks happy when I come home from work. I love deep conversations with people I'll never see again. I love the moon more than the sun. I love Medusa and her head of snakes. I love drawing the hermit card from the tarot deck. I love my Salvador Dali tarot deck. I love being alone in the forest. I love being alone in a field of lavender. I love being alone without feeling lonely. I love being an only child. I love that happy hour isn't always happy. I love not owning a home. I love wooden matches. I love candles with wooden wicks that crackle. I love a wood burning fire. I love people who own fireplaces in Miami. I love that a Miami summer can feel more brutal than a Michigan winter. I love going to the beach when there's no sun. I love a well-made bed and a well-ironed shirt. I love the occasional earworm. I love tuning everything out. I love people who aren't afraid to say no. I love holding the door open for others. I love changing my mind. I love squirrels that store food for the winter. I love food made with love. I love birds that don't fly south for the winter. I love a conspiracy of ravens. I love the seagull I once saw eating a discarded orange. I love a peacock presenting its colors. I love a flamingo standing on one leg. I love the angels that adults leave in the first snow that sticks. I love early spring crocuses as they push through the snow. I love anatomical drawings of the human heart. I love the idea of touring every abandoned asylum. I love that this experience is likely better in my head than it would be in reality. I love frogs croaking in summer ponds. I love paddle boating around lily pads. I love when the muses speak to me. I love the highest note on the violin. I love the French who don't like me. I love wearing my mother's clothes. I love landing in a city I've never been before. I love returning to a city I've loved before. I love train rides to the country. I love ladybugs that don't act like proper ladies. I love deer that make it to the other side of the road. I love the idea that everything really works out in the end. I love a day with no social events. I love you for reading this poem.
Wow. That is wonderful. And it is that hopeful note, at the end. But we have your mother in there too, wearing her clothes. So I really like that also. It's like a balm to hear that. It's really, and as I said, it's something that I think would fulfill one of your wishes for your reader, which is that they also be able to write and work through the grieving process. And it's like you're giving them models for doing that. And I think that's really, really wonderful. Um, reading and rereading your words inspired me to write about my father, who died 9 years ago next month. We were very close, and I've written several poems, but this poem that emerged actually just a few days ago, it emerged nearly whole and more lyrical, because I also tend to write more prose-like and narrative, and it was more lyrical and free in a way than what I usually write. So I wanted to thank you for that,
Oh,
because it was, yeah. And it's funny, I read it to my husband and he was like, wow, that's like complete. I'm like, yeah, it feels pretty complete. That's not usually the case for me. So thank you. So what is your hope for your readers, Nicole?
I don't necessarily want to prescribe something. I want people
Hmm.
to take away from it whatever they take away from it. But I do hope that it is helpful. I will say that. And it's funny because in this note, in the front, in the preface, I'd asked people to work through their grief and if they want to use this as a model. I have not had a single person send me a poem.
Not one?
I would love for someone to send me a poem. I would love that. And it can only be
Yeah.
a few lines, but I'd love to see that. Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be cool.
I bet. I bet. I might have to send you mine, and
Oh,
you'll
I would
have to give
love
me a
that.
little feedback on it.
Oh, I would love that.
Okay. So can you give us a little glimpse into your upcoming publications, what you
Sure.
have?
Sure. So I have Poems for the People coming out in January, and that
Mhm.
is, as the title indicates, poems that I've written that are really, I think, sort of plain and straightforward, and written in a way that I'm hoping people who don't necessarily love poetry or are familiar with poetry will
Mhm.
appreciate, while people who do like poetry will hopefully appreciate it too. So it's kind of written
Mhm.
for everybody. That was my idea with that one. And then I have a second book called Versace, which is coming out in November. And Versace is the word that I just sort of made up for fake Versace products, which I see a lot of in Miami. And it's
Mhm.
just kind of it's an interesting book in the sense that this would be my first full-length poetry book, because Poems for the People is more of a chapbook. I think
Mhm.
I'm still working out the final length of that, but I think it's going to be a chapbook. So I think
Yeah.
Versace will be my first full length poetry book. And
Okay.
this one blends, I mean, there's grief in it because that's just kind of how I am. But this is a book where
Mhm.
I want people to be able to laugh a little bit. So I'm kind of taking the reader through a full spectrum of emotions, I think, and I'm hoping that I'm balancing the light and the dark, yin and yang, a little
Mhm.
bit more with this book, because I
Yeah.
really like people to laugh when they read my
Yes.
work. And sometimes people do and sometimes people don't, but I want to give permission to people to laugh. Because
Sure.
in poetry we don't necessarily take quite as seriously.
Right.
And that's kind of what I'm setting out to do with this book, is to balance
Well,
those things.
I can tell you from experience that that I published, my second chapbook was a book of elegies.
Mm.
And I very quickly discovered from the first reading that I had at Books and Books and other readings that it was not such a joy to do readings with a book that was all elegies.
Mhm.
It was dark for the most part. And, you know, sometimes our personalities are such that it's not the whole experience that we want to give to somebody. And so I still, you know, I sort of keep that in mind, even though my unpublished manuscripts are, I'm not sure that they're also pretty dark because they're based on so much that's been happening in the last few years, besides the pandemics, all the, you know, all the social justice issues, and I very reactive, you know, to stuff. So there is something to, you know, I can understand wanting to have something humorous and more positive to read. It makes for a little bit more comfortable and fun readings, definitely. So, well, I want to thank you so much for this. Your work is beautiful, something kindred, and I'm really looking forward um, to your upcoming books. And when you said November, is that a year from November or November, this November, that your
November
book is coming?
2023.
23, okay.
Most of the people will be in January, and then Versace will be in November.
Okay, excellent. So we'll see you at the book fair again next year
I hope so.
as well. Yeah, definitely. So great. Well, I would like to thank you, the South Florida Poetry Journal, and Michael, and the Miami Book Fair for hosting us. And everybody keep reading and writing. And thank you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Elisa. Those were such thoughtful questions. I really appreciate your close reading. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Take care.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.